So that, when I was finishing my book, and actually deep in the process of writing my last book, Rethinking the South African Crisis, I really got extremely interested in Indian debates and just found the Indian debates really, really compelling. And I actually wrote this, and I was going to, in the last chapter, I was going to sort of incorporate Indian debates. I was going to bring India, South Africa into conversation with one another. And I wrote this monstrous chapter and realized that it just was too much new, complicated material. So I took it out, but I promised myself that I'd come back to it. And then the results of the elections in both South Africa and India announced in May this year, when Narendra Modi and the BJP came into power with, creating arguably the largest fascist state the world has ever seen. This clinched it, and made clear I absolutely had to pursue this project. So for the past few months, I've really been trying to read everything I can find around India. And in my more extreme youth, I worked in Indonesia and also in Bangladesh and Malaysia. But of course, things have moved on in India in some dramatic ways. And what seems to me so interesting as I started to read and think about this is that the early 1990s were a major turning point both in India and in South Africa. And that what we see is sort of three broad sets of forces coming together. First of all, in both India and South Africa, neoliberal capitalism was ushered in by the parties of liberation. Secondly, in both India and South Africa, there was actually an expansion of democracy, with the democratic transition in South Africa in some way finding its analogy in the way in India, I found this term incredibly problematic, but other backward castes who form a huge proportion of the population were sort of recognized in ways that they hadn't been before by the Mandal Commission. And then, of course, really importantly, intensifying expressions of nationalism in both India and South Africa. And what Rethinking the South African Crisis is partly about is the imperative to take multiple expressions or articulations of nationalism seriously. But of course, what's so interesting about India is the way Hindutva, right-wing Hindu nationalism, that has its origins way back in 1925, and that certainly started to boil up in the 70s and the 80s, really burst onto the scene in 1992 with the destruction of the Babri Mosque and, just enormous violence. The big argument that I want to make is that these three forces are playing out in some parallel but distinctively different kinds of ways. And that this is where I'm starting in this project is with the Indian debates, and more specifically with Partha Chatterjee's distinction between civil and political society that has been just enormously influential. And of course, he makes the claim that this distinction obtains not only in India, but in most of the post-colonial world. So I'm sure with this audience, a lot of you already know what this distinction is, but just very quickly, let me explain it in his own words, which is for Chatterjee, civil society refers primarily to the urban middle classes as the, quote, the sphere that seeks to be congruent with the normative models of bourgeois civil society and represents the domain of capitalist hegemony. Political society, on the other hand, is comprised of large segments of the rural and urban poor who, quote, make their claims on government and are in turn governed not within the framework of stable constitutionally defined rights and laws, but rather through temporary, contextual, and unstable arrangements arrived at through direct political negotiations. And this distinction between civil and political society, I would argue, is by far the most important conceptual import from India in South Africa today. It's been very, very widely used. And it it has really powerful intuitive appeal, because these distinctions, of course, map onto very directly the sort of glitzy malls and gated communities on the one hand, and shack settlements on the other. So it really does seem to make sense. So that on the face of it, if anybody, if one's going to be doing a comparative study of India and South Africa, the most obvious thing to do is to use this framework. And what I want to do is argue that actually I need to explain why I'm not going to use it. And that's part of what this talk is about, is trying to work through deeply and seriously what does this concept do, but also what does it not do. And what I want to do is, first of all, there are, of course, intense debates around Chatterjee's distinction, both in India and also in South Africa. So I want to work through these debates. And part of what I've really been paying close attention to is how over the past 10 years, because his first book, The Politics of the Governed, came out in 2004. And it's really interesting how over the past 10 years there have actually been quite, pugnacious critiques, and how Chatterjee has actually shifted somewhat in relation to these critiques. So civil political society is not just a static set of concepts. It is quite flexible and movable. But what I also want to do is try to identify where I think it comes up against limits. And it's those limits that I want to try to define. And then the second thing I want to do is I want to lay out my own discontent with civil and political society, both as theoretical constructs and in terms of their capacity to come to grips with key forces both in India and in South Africa. And the big argument I want to make is that instead of applying abstract concepts like civil and political society, we actually learn a lot more by focusing on spatio-historical processes, both in terms of their specificities, their historical geographical specificities, but also in terms of their interconnections in specific global conjunctures. And then the third thing, and I'm just going to do this very quickly and in a very quick hand-waving way, in my 2002 book, Disabling Globalization, I came up with a concept of what I call relational comparison, that it's not about case A and case B, but understanding how forces at play in different parts of the world are produced in and through their relations with one another. So but what I did in that comparative exercise was to focus on Taiwanese industrialists who moved to Ladysmith and Newcastle. And the sort of comparative work that I'm doing with this project is very different. And what I'm trying to play with, and it's still just a tentative idea, is a notion of what I call conjunctural comparison. And I want to just sketch that out very briefly. But if anybody wants to push me on it, that would be great. Okay, so very quickly, I think I would like to start off with focusing on what is it that makes this notion of political society so compelling. And I think, there are dimensions of it that are very compelling. And in his book, The Politics of the Governed, what Chatterjee did was he talked about how the politics spawned by governmentality, what he's calling governmentalities, these governmental technologies of rule, at the same time create conditions not for a contraction, but rather an expansion of democratic political participation. So what is interesting here is he's saying that political society is not backward. It's not traditional. It does not have some sort of lack in relation to liberal democracy. That on the contrary, it holds out the possibility of different forms of distinctively non-liberal democracy. And I think, that's an extremely interesting and compelling claim. Now, in his 2008 article in Economic and Political Weekly entitled Democracy and Economic Transformation in India, which is really a restatement of of his arguments about civil and political society. And this is an article that has been republished at least 4 or 5 times in pretty much the same form. He makes an additional set of claims around the turn around something that's sort of missing from the politics of the government, which is the incredibly rapid economic growth that happened in India in the context of liberalization of the economy. And he talks about escalating dispossession or primitive accumulation. And the processes through which large numbers of peasants, craftspeople, petty manufacturers are being dispossessed of land and other means of production. And he points as well to the increasingly capital-intensive, technology-dependent forms of production, which mean, quote, that victims of primitive accumulation are completely unlikely to be absorbed into the new capitalist sectors of growth and will continue to be marginalized and rendered, and this is my language now, continue to be marginalized and rendered surplus to the needs of capital, which of course, has these powerful resonances for us. And, he goes on to argue in this more recent version that electoral democracy makes it unacceptable for the government to leave marginalized groups without the means of labor to fend for themselves, since this carries the risk of turning them into the dangerous classes, and hence the imperative for reversing or attempts to reverse the effects of primitive accumulation. And what he goes on to say, the bulk of population in India lives outside the orderly zones of proper civil society. It is in political society that they have to be fed, clothed, given work, if only to ensure the long-term and relatively peaceful well-being of civil society. That is the difficult and innovative process on which a process of politics on which the future of passive revolution under conditions of democracy depends. Now, one of the things I want to do is really highlight this category of passive revolution, because in responding to his critics, and there have been waves of critique, what Chatterjee always does is he invokes passive revolution and invokes what is going on as a new phase of passive revolution. And in all of the critiques that I am aware of, I do not know of anybody who's taken him on that terrain. And if anybody does know of this, I'd like to know really fast, because I don't make erroneous claims. But that's what I want to get to. So very quickly, I just want to summarize what are the main critiques that have been made of Chatterjee. And, in the interest of moving fast, I'm not going to give references, but if anybody wants references, I'd be happy to give them. So, the first main critique is the way he uses these dualistic structures. And what is very clear, everybody who's tried to do any empirical work, and including South Africans who've tried to use these categories to do any sort of empirical work, very, very quickly come up again. This is a very clear, dualisms break down in practice. Amita Bhavishkar makes an interesting additional point in which she argues that what Chatterjee does is he inverts what is actually the case, that members of civil society break laws with impunity, whereas members of political society strive to become legal. Second sort of set of criticisms turns around what is excluded from Chatterjee's category of political society. And Mihir Shah, I think, has made the earliest and still one of the most powerful critiques, where he says, look, one of the really crucially important things that's going on in India today is the Naxalite movement, particularly in in India, they use the term tribal areas, where Adivasis, where are being dispossessed at the most incredible rate. And he makes the point that this is just really problematic to leave, to, in effect, to define, as Chatterjee does, these very important movements as somehow beyond the pale of political society. And, Shah also makes the point that Chatterjee's analysis is any attention to the way class sort of, I would say, articulates with other axes of power around caste, gender, communalism, Hindu, Muslim tensions. And I'm going to argue that what else is missing that's really important is any attention to Hindutva. That's going to be actually my big kind of the point in which I'll move in on Chatterjee. Now, in terms of how Chatterjee has shifted, again, I'm just going to zero in on what I think is actually. There are multiple ways in the book, Lineages of Political Society, published in 2011, I think sort of lays out some of the ways that he's shifted. But I think there's a very interesting piece he published in 2012 entitled After Subaltern Studies, in which he basically said, I am declaring subaltern studies pretty much dead. And political society, civil political society represents a new project, a successor project to political society. And Dipesh Chakrabarty has said, excuse me, it doesn't. But anyway, there's this kind of interesting debate that's going on. But what Chatterjee does there is he distinguishes between contests over the sovereignty. Let me just read it. He said, let me distinguish two aspects of mass politics in contemporary Indian democracy. One that involves a contest over sovereignty with the Indian state, and the other that makes claims on governmental authorities over services and benefits. And what he's saying here is that, yes, the Naxalite movement certainly represents a major contest with the Indian state. And he says, in fact, this is where old subaltern studies, Ranajit Guha, is still salient. But he says, what I'm saying is you look at the common techniques of mass agitation in India today, roadblocks, disruption of train services, destruction of property, setting fire to vehicles, attacking government officials or the police. He said certainly one would find a genealogical link to the old subaltern studies concerned, but he said, I believe it's a mistake to try to understand these activities of contemporary mass politics within the political paradigm of peasant insurgency, and that this is really what political society is all about. And if we're going to be doing new sorts of analysis, what we need actually is a theory of populism and here he turns to, and he does this much more explicitly actually in a very interesting interview with Manu Goswami in Public Culture very recently, where he says, actually we need a theory of populism. And here he invokes Ernesto Leclerc's book on populist reason, which, got my hackles. But there's a very interesting piece by Aditya Nigam in kafila.org, which is actually a review of the 2011 book Lineages of Political Society. And what Nigam does is he acknowledges the ways that Chatterjee has shifted, but he also does, I think, and so it's a sympathetic critique, but it's also very incisive. And he makes a number of points. He says, look, that Chatterjee has recognized violence, he's recognized patriarchy. These are big parts of criticism, but that they're not integrally incorporated in the analysis. They're kind of add-ons. But the key point on which Nigam, and I think it's related to this, is he says that he sees as really problematic Chatterjee's refusal to see uprisings as anything but ephemeral. And here, apparently, what really sort of pushed Chatterjee into taking seriously these arguments about what is and isn't political society was Nandigram. And Nandigram in many ways, it was India's Marikana. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but 2008. But 14 peasants were shot dead protesting dispossession of their land for a special economic zone, and that Chatterjee is quite intransigent about refusing to see these uprisings as anything but forces that have been generated within political society. And he claims that his interest is, quote, in the everyday, which most scholars find boring. So he says that there are all these uprisings, sure, there's Nandigram, others like that, but he said it's actually in at the level of the everyday that we need to pay attention. And what Nigam says is that the problem is that his notion of the everyday really rests on a given static notion where negotiations take place within given configurations of power, in which there's no scope for mass actions or uprisings as moments for renegotiating the terms of power and context of the everyday. And that for Chatterjee, popular politics is always and only directed to governmental welfare, except for these very exceptional cases of the Naxalites. Now, this is a point at which I'd like to, this is a section I call the political states of political society, a South African Gramscian perspective. And just an advance warning here in the interest again of moving really fast, I'm just going to point to my Gramscian discontents with him, and if anybody wants to call me on it, I'd be delighted. And when I meet with the postgraduates tomorrow, I hope we can go into these issues more, in more detail. So as I say, I'm going to be quite telegraphic, because otherwise I'd be rabbiting on for another hour, which I am not allowed to do. Right, fair enough. So, for me, most immediately, what I found really problematic about Chatterjee's categories is his neglect of nationalisms, most notably Hindutva. And it seems to me that this is all the more surprising because Chatterjee is widely seen as the preeminent theorist of Indian nationalism, a nationalist thought in the colonial world, the nation and its fragments. And the question is, why the hell is this? And there's another collection of his essays called Empire and Nation, published in 2010, where with a very interesting introduction by Nivedita Menon. And she actually points to something really intriguing, which is, and it's an essay included in this collection, which is based on a talk that Chatterjee gave in 2000. So it was sort of, and it's where he's really just, you can see he's trying out these ideas. But there's a very interesting, and I actually, to be perfectly frank, I found a little hair-raising paragraph in this essay, in which he says, look, he says that one response by the governing classes in India to pressures from below. He's talking how do the governing classes deal with these growing pressures from below that were sort of, welling up in the 80s, but especially in the 90s. And he says one way has been to wall in the protective zones of bourgeois civil society and dispensing the governmental functions of law and order and welfare through, quote unquote, the natural leaders of the governed populations. Then he goes on to say, this was the response of the industrial and financial elite in Mumbai to the rise of Shiv Sena, quote, the most overtly fascist element in the Hindu right-wing formation. So he is actually attending to Hindutva. But it's really interesting because what he goes on to say is he says there's actually an alternative and much better response. And he says, the other response is less cynical even as it is more pragmatic. It does not abandon the project of enlightenment, but attempts to steer it through the thicket of contestations in what I've called political society. It takes seriously, listen to this, it's really interesting, the functions of direction and leadership of a vanguard, but accepts that the legal arm of the state in a country like India cannot reach into the vast range of social practices that continue to be regulated by other beliefs and administered by other authorities. However, it knows that those dark zones are being penetrated by the welfare functions of modern governmental practices, producing those effects on claims and representation that I have called the urge for democratization. This is the zone in which the project of democratic modernity has to operate slowly, painfully, unsurely. And, so this explains on one level why Chatterjee pays little, if no, attention to Hindutva in his subsequent writings. And, Nivedita, and he say, and it seems to me that what is interesting here is that what this suggests is that political society is not just an analytical category, it's actually a prescriptive category. And I'm going to argue that there are actually very close parallels between Chatterjee and Thabo Mbeki. And that in some sense, they have an identical analysis that emerges at a very similar moment. Now, here is where I want to just move in really quickly on the whole question of why it is that Chatterjee's neglect not just of Hindutva, but of nationalisms more generally, really matters. It's not just that there's a lack, that there's a hole in the analysis. It really matters. And it matters if one is trying to undertake a serious Gramscian analysis. Because and that my deeper problem with Chatterjee is that what he does is he deploys Gramscian concepts and then proceeds to eviscerate them. And there's a book called The Post-Colonial Gramsci, where he has a version of democracy and economic transformation in India, in which he claims very close affinity with Gramsci. The first and most important reason why this neglect of nationalisms matters is that any analysis of hegemony, I would argue, has to pay attention to nationalisms, and that a key issue in both South Africa and India requires attention, in fact, to the specificity of post-colonial nationalisms, which, ironically, was what Chatterjee really made his initial name around. Now, what Chatterjee does is he actually sidesteps this whole issue by confining hegemony to civil society and governmentality. So he's got Gramsci in civil society, Foucault in political society. And he justifies this distinction by invoking another Gramscian concept, which is passive revolution. And then what he does is he deploys a totally problematic conception and misreading, and I would fiercely argue this point, a fundamental misreading of Gramsci's concept of passive revolution. And he works with two concepts of passive revolution, one as domination without hegemony, which harks back to early subaltern studies. And secondly, he argues that Gramsci used passive revolution, applying it to Italy at the time of the Risorgimento in 1860, the moment of Indian national unification, when he contrasted what was going on in Italy, where pressure from below was co-opted from above by the moderates, and the old landed elite was kept in place, as opposed to what happened in the French Revolution, where the Jacobins, of course, overthrew the feudal classes and allied with the peasantry. So he sees this paradigmatic Western model as characterized by the Jacobins. And that part of what makes Gramsci relevant then is that he's setting up an exception to a paradigmatic Western model. Now, these are, as I say, really profound and deeply problematic misreadings of passive revolution. And I'm going to come back to this. But let me just very quickly argue. I just very quickly want to try to illustrate some of these arguments about why Chatterjee's neglect of nationalisms matters with respect to my own work in South Africa. And I realize that some of you, maybe many of you, were at the when I launched my book here just over a year ago, in fact. So, I don't want to I just very briefly want to sort of outline the big arguments of the book to illustrate where and how Chatterjee just, I think, can't even begin to provide us with sufficient traction for what's going on in South Africa. So, here is where one of the things that's really interesting is that it was in 2004, with the defeat of the BJP, that the Congress party that came back into power in India really turned in a much more pro-poor direction with the national rural employment guarantee scheme. And by the way, I skipped over one of the critiques of Chatterjee, is that what he sees as coming from the wisdom of the governing classes actually was as much a product of organizing from below. And that's an important thing that I missed out in trying to move fast. But, here's where the parallel with South Africa really comes in, and it's with Mbeki's statement in July of 2003 that South Africa consisted of a first and a second economy. And his first statement was in a press conference following a cabinet Lekgotla. And so he went out, and there were all these journalists sitting around with their computers, and he says, okay, so we are this modern part of South Africa with your aeroplanes, your computers, and people sitting around the room who read and write and so on. We are this modern sector. Then he goes on to say, so then you have this large part of South Africa which is relatively uneducated, it is unskilled, it is not required in terms of modern society. And then you can see him saying, oh, I shouldn't have said that. And he says, I'm saying required instead of in the sense of employability. But then what he goes on to do is say this is the second economy, and we have to put some kind of a safety net under it. And this is what in fact is, and this was the moment when the ANC government moved from the sort of fierce fiscal austerity of the first phase of the post-apartheid order to, for instance, putting much more money into local government, much more money into social grants, setting up and funding in quite a serious way municipal indigence policy. But it seems to me that the key thing that we need to understand, and this is what my book is all about, is how it is that over this decade of the 2000s, 2001 to Bredell to Marikana, which is really the period that my book deals with, that we have this phenomenon, on the one hand, of more and more money going into all these efforts to contain popular discontent, at the same time as actually these popular antagonisms are just burgeoning. And so, and of course there are increasing tensions within the ANC. And an important part of what my book is about is an argument that since 2000, whereas in my earlier book I argued that in the first phase of the post-apartheid order, 96 to 2000, that local government was a key site of contradictions. What I argue now is that since 2001, local government has actually become the key site of contradictions. And one of the things and this is not just a matter of, and one of the things I'm arguing very fiercely against is those who are saying, oh, well, it's just more and more top-down neoliberalism that calls forth bottom-up resistance. It's a kind of a, popcorn protest, a kind of what I call a hydraulic model where neoliberalism calls calls forth protest. There's something much more complicated going on. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is through in-depth ethnographic work that I've been doing in Ladysmith and Newcastle since 1994, is to show how it's not just a matter of incompetence, and it's not just a matter of corruption, that there are actually deep, profound circuits through which these efforts to try to contain popular discontent in complicated ways are playing into and actually igniting popular anger, and therefore generating the very conditions that they were designed to contain. And then I argue that these these contradictions that we can see very concretely playing out at the level of local government actually have to be situated in relation to what I call simultaneous processes of denationalization and renationalization that are playing out in relation to one another in increasingly conflictual ways. And denationalization, just very quickly, refers not just to neoliberalism. I argue neoliberalism is not enough. It's about the particular set of alliances that got forged between the ANC and corporate capital that enabled corporate capital, frankly, to get the hell out, which was what it wanted to do after having been cooped up over the 90s. And that I can't go into detail, but my big argument is that that debating whether or not we're neoliberal is a ridiculous and not useful debate. That the real issue is massive ongoing capital flight and a series, the forces that are generating increasingly concentrated wealth and increasingly also generating what Michael Denning calls wageless life, of how huge numbers of people are increasingly being rendered surplus to the requirements of capital. The other piece of the argument about renationalization is that when the ANC and political parties were unbanned, that the nation as such did not exist. It had to be produced anew. And that the Rainbow Nation and all of that was part of it, but really a hugely important part of a whole, and there are a whole array of what I call renationalizing practices and processes. A really key dimension of all of that are the key words of African nationalism. So it's the National Democratic Revolution, it's the Freedom Charter, but more deeply it's the ability to articulate the nation and liberation, and it's a certain kind of understanding of the past that has been produced that resonates very deeply with very large numbers of people. So it's not just an interpolation from above. There are real popular resonances, and that these are absolutely crucial to the ANC's hegemony. But precisely because there's popular traction, but at the same time, because these articulations of the nation and liberation and a better life for all and our people, etc., that precisely because they are holding open, they are making claims about a better life for all, that they open the ANC up to charges of betrayal. And these charges then are intensified by the way denationalization is playing out in practice. So that there's these contradictions at the level that we see playing out at the level of local government that are always specific, are also shaped by these simultaneous processes of de- and renationalization at the same time that they are also feeding into them. And I'd be happy to give examples of that. And that this is the contradiction that is built into the ANC's hegemonic project, that capital and the black and white bourgeoisie in this country more generally need the ANC to keep the lid on things, but the processes of denationalization are creating conditions in which this is becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible. And that these are the forces that are generating populist politics, and that the EFF is a continuation of this. And now maybe we can get into the debate about it. I've just been in Joburg for 4 days where, a continuous debate about is the EFF fascist. And I would argue, and this is where India comes in, that it's much more complicated than that. So just I can just 1 minute. Okay. So just really quickly, what might an alternative look like? And this is where this whole idea, I think, of conjunctural comparison becomes important. And just very quickly, let me sort of work through some of these incredible forces that the parallels. So just that this whole question of India's turn to what they call, they use liberalizing the economy rather than neoliberalism. That it was not just a matter of that it was the Congress Party that actually brought in neoliberal economic policies. What's really interesting, what I'm suggesting and trying to think with is, to what extent might this be useful? Might it be useful to think of India's turn to liberalization as a form of denationalization? And that but it's different from South Africa, because what happened in India over the 80s was Rajiv Gandhi was opening up the Indian economy. And so that in some sense the liberalization, and this is when the NRIs and so forth became very important, that what is really interesting is that in India, denationalization represents the opening up, or the further opening up of what had historically been a relatively closed economy. Whereas in South Africa over the 1980s, there was a sort of enclosure of the economy, and this is where capital was trapped by sanctions, exchange controls, the crisis of the apartheid state. So South Africa is a historically open economy that was closed during the 80s, and denationalization is an opening up. So they're both opening up after different, so that there are different, the point I'm trying to make here is that there are historically specific dynamics at play there. The whole question of what happened around caste in India, I think, is really interesting and goes back to struggles in the late 70s and 80s. And, this is where the 70s and 80s in India and South Africa are both interesting. But castes who had been sort of largely excluded from Nehruvian development were really kind of bursting onto the scene. In ways that, have certain kinds of parallels with what was going on in South Africa. And the whole question of caste and race, I think, is extremely interesting. But then finally, this is where the issue of articulations of nationalism become extremely important. And here is where Hindutva, one of the things that I think has come out of, one of the things I really learned that came clear from these past few days in Joburg, is that what is so interesting, that both EFF and NUMSA are both using the Freedom Charter. They're both situating themselves on the terrain of Congress articulations of nationalism, taking it in different directions, using it to hold the ANC up to shame. But what is so interestingly different about the RSS, the Sangh Parivar, the Shiv Sena, all these institutions of Hindutva, is that right from the get-go, they are set up very much in opposition to Congress. And it's only in and really following Gandhi's assassination, they really sort of go underground, and they start re-emerging, they kind of stick their noses over the fence in the 80s, but it's really in 92 that with the Babri Mosque that Hindutva really comes back with a bang. And, I think there are very interesting arguments about how this is actually related to the Mandal Commission, which recognized the OBCs. And so the broader set of issues that it seems to me are really interesting in thinking about India, South Africa in relation to one another, really turn around the ways in which class, race, caste, gender, sexuality, nationalisms are all working in and through one another. And it seems to me that really trying in this very historically specific way to get at some of these dynamics holds open what I call the possibility of mutual illuminations, of sort of seeing India, South Africa in relation to each other, and both the similarities and differences sort of helping us to denaturalize our own understandings and see ourselves as a particular sort of set of forces in a much wider array of processes that are taking different forms in different parts of the world.
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much, Jill, for a stimulating